So good morning, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of Sunday School. I guess good afternoon for some people, depending on if you're joining us from Atlantic Canada. Um, we're joined today for a session on overcoming addiction by retired physician Harvey Michaluk. Did I pronounce that correctly, Harvey?
Sounds good.
Okay, perfect. So he's got a pretty robust presentation on addiction and getting past it. And addiction could be an addiction to cigarettes or alcohol or drugs or porn or gambling or any number of things. Um, and it doesn't necessarily, your attendance here today doesn't necessarily mean that you're dealing with addiction yourself. It could be that you're seeking resources to help other people who are loved ones in your life who you want to help overcome addiction. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Harvey. You can introduce yourself and you can share screen whenever you're ready.
Okay, thanks, Gavin. Welcome to everybody. I'm hoping that none of you struggle with addiction, but I think as men, we often self-medicate when we have bad days, and that's not a good habit. And so this presentation is going to be majoring on that, about self-medicating, and instead of doing something different. A bit of a disclaimer. What I'll be talking about is mostly a musing of my own journey with addiction and my observations through the years as a physician, as a sponsor in Alcoholics Anonymous, and as a mentor to many people over the years. So this isn't a literature review. That would bore you to death, especially today when addiction science is rather confusing. And this is not intended to give medical advice as well to follow, because I'm not currently licensed to give that kind of advice. So indeed, if you are having issues with addiction, please do seek professional advice. Now, every addiction starts with pain and ends with pain. I think most people would agree with that. I volunteer at a addiction center, and every story that I hear is all about that, starting off with pain in teenage years or thereafter. And so if you don't do anything about it, that's what happens. You end up in a drug treatment center like I did myself. Every now and then I'll have someone come up to me and say, well, Harvey, I only do drugs when I'm bored. I'm not in pain. But that's interesting. If you do a study about boredom, you'll realize that there's much more to it than that. Some people have described it like this: boredom is a state of failing to find meaning, which is a deeply uncomfortable feeling. So boredom is very common amongst people, and they need to see it as a red flag that something's not quite right. It sounds like pain to me. So every human being suffers trauma. Trauma just means to be wounded by something or somebody. Now, men deal with physical pain generally quite well. I worked as an anesthesiologist for decades, running an acute pain service. So most men, right after surgery, they want no pain. But when it comes to emotional pain, it's different for some reason. Men seem to see emotional pain as sort of starting at the point where they can no longer tolerate it, rather than the point where it actually originates, sometimes back in the teenage years. So when it reaches that crescendo where you can no longer tolerate it, what do men do? Well, it's easy to self-medicate. Whatever is your favorite candy. Often it's alcohol or just flicking through your cell phone, going onto Twitter, and just going on and on and on, just to zone out, I guess, is what people do it. So they self-medicate quite early. And maybe that's why the rate of substance dependence in men is twice that of women. Women handle emotional pain better, it seems. Here's a latest stat that I obtained from this website that says that 22% of males and 17% of females used illegal drugs or misused prescription drugs within the last year. So maybe things are changing. Maybe fewer men are doing this, and maybe more females are doing this. But nonetheless, if you look at this statistic, it's really 1 in 4 men who have trouble. That's quite a lot. Here's a definition of addiction. It's sort of rather cumbersome, but it says that addiction is an attempt to escape pain through activity that brings short-term relief. It acts as a painkiller, but over the long term actually adds to the original pain and creates more need for the addictive activity. That's sort of one form of the addictive cycle. Addiction is actually a spectrum. So if you self-medicate with whatever, you're somewhere on the spectrum. So here's this guy, he comes home from work, had a bad day, and what does he do? Instead of dealing with the pain, he resorts to going numb on his favorite beverage, alcohol, beer, whatever. Because he doesn't really deal with the pain, he keeps doing this over and over again. And then over a period of time, it's easy for this guy to end up on the right side of this spectrum of becoming not only psychologically addicted to alcohol, but also physically addicted, which is not a good place to be. Now, not everyone ends up on the right side of the spectrum, and that's interesting. The DSM-5, which is sort of the Bible used by psychologists and psychiatrists, that has all these criteria for different mental illnesses, has 11 criteria to decide where you are on the spectrum. And these criteria are grouped into 4 categories: physical dependence, risky use, social problems, and impaired control. And as you can see there, if you have 6 or more symptoms, this indicates a very severe substance use disorder. And that's very serious and needs immediate treatment. Now, on the right side of the spectrum, I have this thing called addiction plus, because there is a subgroup of people who use drugs or alcohol, and quickly they get into trouble with mental illness, substance-induced mental illness. And this is quite a serious thing. Teenagers who misuse marijuana, for example, often enter their 20s with a full-blown schizophrenia. Now, whether they were genetically predisposed to develop this later is possible, but drug-induced mental illness is quite common in a certain group of people. Now, addiction is a complex disorder. Not everyone ends up on the right side of the spectrum. It's influenced by biology, psychology, and social factors. So if you have a first-degree relative who is an addict, you have 40 to 60% chance of becoming an addict yourself. But genetics alone are not determinative. It doesn't mean you will become an addict. You need to have some other factors going on here. If you have a mental illness, you have a mood disorder or ADHD or a psychosis, a bipolar disorder, or if you have a kind of personality that can't handle much stress, logically you're going to self-medicate. It seems quite common. If you add to that social factors, if you grew up in a dysfunctional family like I did, where there was a lot of chaos and anger, and then you end up in poverty or worse, homeless, you are great risk to self-medicate. Now, if your marriage breaks up, that is hugely stressful. On the stress scale, it's up there with losing a spouse, because really, technically, that's what's happened. So that is another risk factor for self-medicating and ending up with a real problem. Now, you can imagine if you have all these factors going on at the same time, like I did. Wow, that is scary, and that should be a red flag to say I have to be very careful with substances. Now, I said that addiction begins with pain, and so I want to say something about pain. Pain results from stories we tell ourselves, from wounding in our past or even our present that isn't resolved. These stories are often accompanied by shame and guilt, often false guilt. The problem isn't the trauma itself, but the stories we tell ourselves about what happened in the past. And interestingly, such stories are seldom accurate. My stories definitely were not. So the problem is the story. And if you see if your story is all black about what happened to you in the past, that's pretty serious. The implications are great for you becoming quite sick. So that's sort of what happened to me. My dad drank a lot. He suffered from a lot of depression, and he treated it with alcohol. He was emotionally absent in the family. By the age of 15, I believed that my family would be better off without him. I saw him as totally black. That's crazy to tell myself that kind of story. Later on, I learned that my father was a very broken individual. He had a lot of bad things happen to him. An industrial accident when he was 19, he lost his entire leg and had to deal with that, and spent, I think, a year in hospital as they tried to save this leg, and eventually had to have it amputated. Thereafter, he started a business. It was extremely successful until someone set fire to it, and it all burnt down, and he lost everything and ended up a very poor individual. But then, I was made aware that my dad still provided for the family. We were never short of food or clothing. He also drove my sister and I to school every day from our little rural farm. He made sure that education was very important for both my sister and I. And I began to see that my story, that my father was totally black, was really quite wrong. So I see stories as presenting a dialectic with opposites existing in the story. As you see your story of trauma in the past, you can be happy, you can be sad and happy in the same story. And for me to get well, I had to learn to tell myself the correct story, not just looking at the negative things, which would make me sick, but there are positive things that happened to me in that story. Later on in my 20s, I met this girl, and I fell madly in love. I was busy in medical school. It was a difficult relationship. Nonetheless, I loved her dearly. And then things fell apart, and she ran off with an RCMP officer. Of course, I was angry, bitter, resentful, and wanted revenge. Extreme pain. I was so busy in medical school. I think we men have this maybe advantage, disadvantage of just putting things aside that bother us and just get lost in our careers. And that's certainly what I did. But the pain didn't go away. It became intolerable. So you can imagine what I did. I self-medicated, initially with alcohol, but then the hangovers were terrible. I couldn't work. And I found opiates were things that didn't give me a hangover, relaxed me, made the pain go away. And then I got addicted, and that was not fun. So the story I was telling myself wasn't the full story. It was just making the pain worse when I saw all the negative things about that relationship. I needed again to see that story as a dialectic. And what I saw was, it was my first love. It was better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. That's a truism. I can be happy about that. And as I began to recall the good times we had, it made me happier. It seemed to make the pain less. Yeah, I was sad that it ended, but I knew then that I needed to grieve the loss and forgive. And the thing that I learned about forgiveness is that I had to respect her for doing what she did. She has that right, that freedom of choice that I had to respect, even though I didn't like it. It was realistic to respect her choice, and even though I had to suffer the consequences. That did help me to get better. Now, the sad thing here for me is that where did we learn how to deal with pain? This is sort of the elephant in the room. I never learned it in school. No one taught it to me at home. And certainly in medical school, I learned to manage physical pain, but not that much how to handle emotional pain for myself. So addiction, what do you think of? Of course, it's the natural culprits: heroin, cocaine, marijuana, or alcohol. And then there are behavioral addictions like gambling, as Gavin mentioned, pornography, overeating, and various sex addictions. But addiction can involve anything. And that's why the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Diseases, lists it as a substance use disorder. So it can be relationships, codependency, and those kinds of enmeshed relationships are extremely bad and painful. Achievement, food, you're in pain, you go to the fridge and eat comfort food and sugar, things like that. And then you end up 200 pounds, which is very painful. Status, buying stuff. You come home, had a bad day, you go on Amazon, add to cart, that sort of stuff. Work, internet addiction exploded during COVID, and it is a big problem with many men, especially with cell phones, dealing with boredom by just going through Twitter or other social media apps. Going to the gym, sports, Netflix, card games, all of these things can involve addiction. Notice that all of these are normal, everyday activities that we all do. I mean, who doesn't go to Amazon and add to cart? But the addiction isn't the activity itself, because it can be any activity. But addiction is about the purpose of the activity. If you're doing the activity to escape pain and it feels like you have no other choice at the moment, and it only works temporarily before you have to do it again, that's abusing. That's a kind of self-medication that is maladaptive. So you see here, the problem isn't the alcohol, but the purpose of that alcohol. We'll talk in a few minutes about if you did a brain scan of the people in the first picture and compare it to the brain scan of the second person, and you can measure all the different reward hormones going on, you would see it's vastly different. So this brings us to the addictive cycle of how it works. So you're in pain, you choose your favorite candy, and of course you enjoy it, otherwise you wouldn't do it. What happens? You get a dopamine surge in your brain. Dopamine is a normal brain chemical. It's your motivator. It motivates you to do things. But it's also a very powerful reinforcer that will have you remember how good it feels to drink that alcohol, especially when you're hurting. And so dopamine reinforces these brain pathways that say, enjoy, enjoy. When you're in pain, enjoy your favorite candy. So if you don't deal with the pain, of course, you're going to start abusing it. And pretty soon, you become dependent on it psychologically. And so now you develop tolerance. It doesn't work as well. So you have to increase the dose. And you go round and round, and it gets worse and worse because you're not really dealing with the problem. So you can say to me, Harvey, I get it. Abusing is wrong. What's wrong with just occasionally using alcohol or marijuana to deal with the pain of life? What's wrong with that? Come on. Well, self-medicating can rewire your brain. Now, there's no wires in your brain. What I mean is that each time you do that, you enjoy a dopamine surge. And if you know about engines and what a turbocharger does to an engine, dopamine does that to brain pathways. It energizes them and causes you to remember how you felt self-medicating and to do it again and again each time you feel hurt or having a lot of pain. So instead, get help for the pain, get it resolved, and then learn a better way. Well, there's the better way. Get high on life. Now, I've said that I am a KISS person. I love KISS, not the band, but the principle of keeping it simple. And you might say, Harvey, this is really simplistic, getting high on life. I thought the same. When I was down in the treatment center in the United States, I was just coming to, there was this girl who sang the song, played the guitar, and this was the refrain, get high on life. I thought she's crazy. She's really brain damaged, like life sucks. Come on, get high on life. What? How silly. But this girl was simply illustrating Jordan Peterson's 9th rule for life. Assume that the person you are listening to might know something you don't. And she clearly did. And these 4 little words, get high on life, have stuck in my brain. And they come to me every time, I'm in pain or something. I need to understand what she meant by that. Because it's easy to get stuck if we think we are entitled to a good life. It's easy to become the victim of circumstances and go down this rabbit hole, and you know where that ends. Not very pleasant. So the reality is we need to grow up and understand that we're not entitled to a good life, nor are we not entitled to a good life. Life just happens. And so Harvey needed to grow up and learn that life is simply an adventure. And the only thing I can do is to enjoy the ride. Now, I want to introduce you to my favorite hero or heroine, Marsha Linehan. Her story is absolutely remarkable. I read it every now and then. At the age of 19, she ended up in the psychiatric hospital, terribly psychotic, had to have shock treatments and all kinds of terrible major tranquilizers to deal with this. She had a horrible time, but then she got better and she became a psychologist and is the mother of dialectical behavior therapy, which is a marvelous treatment for people who are suicidal, people who are depressed, used for borderline treatment disorder, and even being used for PTSD. Marcia learned how to accept her warts and blemishes without judging them, and being open to change. A very peaceful place to be. Her therapy majors on mindfulness, being present in the moment, not judging anything. And it's a wonderful treatment. Marcia learned to enjoy the ride. What's interesting for me is that Marcia had a spiritual experience that we'll talk about later that really helped her get well. So to enjoy life, we have the brain reward system. We all have this. This is how it works. I go to the gym Tuesdays and Thursdays. Now, some Tuesdays, I have this incredible inertia. I don't feel like going, I'm just, I don't know what it is. All of a sudden, my brain reward system says, but Harvey, you know what it feels like after you work out. You feel younger, and at age 72, that's important to feel younger. And then, remember how you go to this sauna and you talk with the guys and you make conversation and you get connected, and it feels so good. When you walk back to your car, you think, yes, that was good. And so I remember this on Tuesday morning with all this inertia, and I think, yes, I'm going to the gym. So that's how this works. And we need to recognize that we have these feel-good hormones, dopamine, serotonin, endorphins, oxytocin, prolactin, and there are others. And we know that what these hormones cause. I've mentioned dopamine. Serotonin is a mood booster. Endorphins, which were my favorite, make you feel really well. And of course, oxytocin, the love hormone, wonderful. Prolactin causes relaxation. So getting back to this guy, why drowning your sorrows with beers or porn isn't cool? Why? Because all you're doing here is giving yourself a dopamine surge in your brain. You want to avoid that. Although it is pleasurable, the problem with that is that much dopamine reinforces these pathways, and you get into a bad habit, which can lead to addiction. Here's how it works. This is a graph of dopamine levels in your brain. So you decide you're not feeling good, you're bored, you enter into a porn session, and you get this burst of dopamine, and it peaks very quickly. But dopamine doesn't last that long in your brain. It quickly either gets broken down or taken back into storage granules to be released again. But the problem is that this is where it's supposed to be, but now you're up here, and then you've used so much of it that you have a period of time where you have a dopamine deficit. You sort of crash here because you've used up so much dopamine. Being in this area here with so little dopamine is most unpleasant. They call it the dopamine blues. There's actually a band that makes a song called the Dopamine Blues. I've forgotten the name of the band. But this is how it feels. You don't feel good about yourself after you've done a porn session. You have low ambition at the time. You're bored again. You might be moody. Your wife says, "What's wrong with you?" You're tired. You can have brain fog, sort of apathetic about doing anything else. And if you're here too long in this crash zone, you can even gain weight over time. So it's most unpleasant. That's why I made it red. So the temptation is to repeat number one, whatever it was you were doing. Maybe increase the dose a bit. But depending on the time frame between 1 and 2, there may be not enough dopamine. You certainly won't get back there. you may get back to baseline, maybe a bit more. So you really won't feel like you did there. So you might be tempted then to do it again, and even a bigger dose. Now, this is what addiction looks like. Addicts who are on the right side of that spectrum that I mentioned live in this area of dopamine blues. And they have been there so long, and they've used so much of these drugs that their baseline actually has slipped down. This is where they live, a very unpleasant place, so that the normal activities of life no longer bring them pleasure. And so they use and use and use again, just to feel normal, just to be where they're supposed to be. A very bad place to be. Now, what is trendy these days is dopamine detox. And there are many internet strategies to accomplish this, sort of similar to intermittent fasting, if you've done that. You restrict certain activities that you find may be compulsive or addictive. And it's a form of cognitive behavioral therapy, originally described by Dr. Siepel, who is a psychiatrist. So it's a behavioral intervention to reduce or even eliminate some of these possibly compulsive and addictive behaviors to treat these dopamine blues. So there's all kinds of these things, surfing the internet, social media apps, even messaging. You get a message every second, you have to respond to it, and you can get quite addicted to that. Email, gaming, sugar, pornography, masturbation, food, there's so many of these things. And what you're trying to do is avoid these peaks. You don't want these dopamine surges. You're trying to treat this deficit. You want to get back to baseline. So if you're having these kinds of symptoms of dopamine blues, and you think that you have compulsive and addictive behaviors, should you do a dopamine detox? Should you go on the internet and find these strategies? I would say no. Why? Well, look at these symptoms. These are serious symptoms. Impotence, oh my goodness. Brain fog. No, you shouldn't do it yourself, not by yourself. What you should do is see a cognitive behavioral counselor to treat these compulsive and addictive behaviors. Because the problem here is, you might think dopamine is the culprit, is the enemy. But dopamine is not a toxin. It's normally present in your brain. The problem isn't the dopamine, the problem are these behaviors. Dr. Siegel has recently recanted with this name here. It's really a misnomer. Dopamine is not a toxin. And Dr. Siegel really meant with this process to say, this is the problem. See a counselor to deal with this, because these are serious symptoms. And then learn a better way forward. So a better way to get high on life is, why not do an activity that activates the whole reward system? Why are you limiting yourself just to dopamine? I mean, there's all these others. You want to get high on life like this fellow here. Well, I'm sorry, this is my busiest slide, because I'm really into this, about how to get high on life, how to feel good. Here's this slide again that I showed you earlier. This kind of activity boosts all of these hormones, celebrating something, connecting with friends. This is what life is about. So not only does it release all of these things, I mean, oxytocin, who doesn't want to feel loved? But every time oxytocin is released in your brain, prolactin follows it as well. And prolactin is a relaxer, but notice it's also a dopamine suppressor. So this kind of activity doesn't give you that dopamine surge that we talked about earlier. So what about if you're in pain, how do you get high in life when you're in pain? Well, go find someone who will listen to you when you're in pain, who will touch you and give you a hug and make you feel loved with oxytocin. Spend some hours talking through what it is that's bothering you. You will come back home not with dopamine blues, but you will feel so much better. Go out into nature and be loved by nature. Look at the colors that exist there. They're not just there randomly. They're there for a purpose. Doing that, likewise, releases all of these good hormones. Going for a run, especially with a friend, is hugely useful. Aerobic exercise like running is as good in some studies to treat depression. A wonderful activity, again, that releases all of these feel-good hormones. If you like reading, get a good book and read the book. Put away your cell phone. Don't read and then go on your cell phone every few minutes. That isn't useful. If you're bored and you have spare time, doing volunteer work is wonderful to be able to serve your community and to be with people. It's magical in getting high on life. I'm a huge champion of all of these activities. Johann Hari famously concludes that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. It's not just stopping whatever you're using. It's human connection, because we were really meant to live in community. Now, obviously, pain and isolation is a bad combination because you'll be tempted to self-medicate with either dopamine stimulating things like marijuana or alcohol, pornography. Well, for me, it was opiates as the sole thing that I used to deal with my pain. But what if you're already in this addictive cycle and moving toward the right of the spectrum, and you're over here? Without treatment, there is progression and consequences. If you're addicted to smoking, for example, and you don't deal with it, well, you could end up with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, emphysema, or worse, lung cancer. It begins with pain and it ends with pain without treatment. If you're over here on the right side of the spectrum, you really need an intervention, which is sort of a medical term where people who care about you, friends, coworkers, orchestrate this intervention where they surprise you. You come to work and there they are, your family, your boss, your coworkers, and say, we're really worried about you. You need treatment. If you don't, you're going to lose friends and family. So you go to treatment, and depending on the behavior, you're going to have detox. I volunteer at a treatment center, and there I meet people who are addicted to alcohol, drugs, to social media, pornography, gambling, so many different substances. And I'm glad to see that they're there for treatment. So there are inpatient, outpatient treatment facilities. You might need pharmaceuticals if you have mental illness, whether they're intensive psychotherapy. But simply stopping the addictive behavior doesn't work. One must deal with underlying pain. And here, trauma-informed counseling is very useful, as well as group therapy. And there are many places for that. Grief Share, Divorce Care, Jürgen did a great job at that. And of course, the CCMF support groups. There's one now every day of the week. Take advantage of those guys. And then there are the 12-step programs. And what these offer is community. And that is so good, that kind of connection. I want to talk a bit about agency, which is a Latin word from agentia, the capacity to exert power to produce an effect. For us, it means the human capacity to move forward, to heal the pain, and to overcome the addictive behaviors. Now, I think we can all agree that gaining agency is the key to healing. So how do we gain agency? There are two paradigms that I want to talk about, and those are based on two worldviews. The first is the humanistic view, which is a naturalistic philosophy based on reason and science. People are born with the potential for human goodness and moral development. Of course, this is true. But the problem here is potential. Not all of us start at the same place. Some of us have been so badly damaged that the potential for how far we can go is not the same. The other problem is being human itself, something I call the human conundrum. I don't really understand myself, for I want to do what is right, but I don't do it. Instead, I do what I hate. You and I have this problem. You know, we have the tools to do the right thing, but we don't always do them. So the second worldview is what I call the sacred spiritual. It's mostly the Judeo-Christian view, which says that humans are born with defects of character, with limited agency to effect change, and they need transcendent agency and transformation. They need a higher power than themselves. This isn't a very popular view these days, but nonetheless, there it is, and it saved my life. So a humanistic approach to agency is this. Humans have the agency to move forward, to heal the pain, to overcome the addictive behaviors if they have the correct tools. So therapy is by a marketplace psychologists, psychiatrists, counselors, life coaches, mentors, and so on, can get pretty expensive. But many overcome addiction by these treatment programs. Yet there are relapses that occur. The sacred spiritual approach is science, yes, but the need for a higher power, 12-step programs, pastoral counseling, prayer for God to intervene and heal. Relapse is actually less here. Some never relapse, like me. So the reality with addiction is that it is a spectrum. And if anyone is self-medicating, you're somewhere on this spectrum. So suppose you say, Harvey, well, you know what? I am one of these people who self-medicate. I want to stop. How can I do it? Well, hopefully you've just started. You're just beginning here. Maybe it's enough for you to realize that self-medication is maladaptive. It doesn't help over the long term. All it does is cause these dopamine surges, which leaves you down here with dopamine blues. Not a good idea. Because you're just starting early, you can deny yourself this and learn to connect with other people to deal with the pain. So a simple way of doing this is to make yourself a card like this with the stop sign on the front, and maybe in the back, put this graph there. Put it in your pocket. Each time you feel sad or you're hurting and you want to self-medicate, pull out the card. The stop sign, not only does it activate your brain, but it makes your emotions sort of wake up and think, oh, this isn't good. And then you turn it around and you look, oh my goodness, I don't want that anymore. I've been there, I don't want it. If you keep doing this over a period of days, weeks, what happens? Well, all of a sudden you'll notice that you have more energy, clearer, better thinking. You feel so much better, of course. And that's what you want to remember, that is a good way to live. Now, some of people are further along on the spectrum. You're down here many days feeling not that good. Now, unfortunately, simply denying yourself your favorite self-medication won't work anymore. Your brain has been altered. You're going to have a problem with intense craving. So if you try to deny yourself this self-medication, your brain will say, no, that's cruel. That's not a good idea. You work so hard. You deserve this. Your ex did this and this to you. You really deserve this self-medication. So denying won't work. Instead, what might work is delay and distract. Those of you who have kids know how well distraction works with kids to move them from one activity to another. And distraction works with adults as well. So you delay things. So if your habit is to wake up in the morning and the first thing you do is you light a cigarette. So instead, you say, I'm not going to deny myself the cigarette, but I'm going to delay it for an hour. I'm going to go for a walk instead. Then I'm going to call my friend and talk to them. The next day, instead of delaying 1 hour when you wake up in the morning, you extend that to 2 hours, and so on. This works really well with cigarette addiction and some other things as well, like pornography. So instead, now you make yourself a card with delay on it. And you maybe put this graph at the back of the card to remind you that you don't want to do this again. And you want to delay. And that way, it is a useful method, a simple method, sort of the KISS principle of how to deal with some of these methods of not self-medicating. Unfortunately, if you're further along on this spectrum, you're going to need more help. You'll need a lot of psychotherapy, group therapy, pharmaceuticals if you have comorbidities like some sort of mental illness. And you might have to spend 1 to 3 years in an inpatient treatment facility so that your brain can heal. Brains can remarkably heal from the damage that dopamine has done or opiates. But unfortunately, you're at high risk here for relapse more than once. The craving is going to recur, and you might need extra pharmaceuticals. There are medications to use to deal with nicotine craving, to use with alcohol, as well as opiates. The question is here, why the relapse? And that's a $1 million question. My feeling is that it's the human conundrum that we all have, some of us more than others, lacking agency to stop the temptation to self-medicate. Now, if you talk to addiction specialists, they will say, yeah, Harvey, that is, agency is a problem for sure, but we can't do anything about it because addiction specialists see addiction as a chronic disease. And a chronic disease is a medical term, which built into it is relapse. So if you have any kind of chronic disease, you're bound to relapse. Take diabetes, for example. You're on insulin to maintain your blood sugars. Every now and then you go on a sugar binge. You go out with your friends, you can have pizza, you can have chocolate cake, and you think, oh, what the hell, I'm just going to do it once. And then for the next 3 days or a week, you're trying to balance the insulin requirements. So they see addiction as a chronic disease that people relapse and relapse, and they just have to keep going back to treatment, or else they need something else. And this is where in Vancouver, and I think in London, Ontario, and some other places, they've introduced what they call safe supply, where the addicts just need to be given fentanyl or hydromorphone because they need it to stay normal. That's sort of what's happening today. But there's a lesson from history here. This isn't a new problem. In the 1940s, professionals were stuck to treat alcohol addiction. Psychology, psychiatry wasn't working. They recognized that the problem was agency. Then came Alcoholics Anonymous, 12-step programs. And wow, it was incredible. Even Skid Row alcoholics and drug addicts found agency and got better. They became abstinent and never went back. So many have gained agency through 12-step programs, and I'm a champion of them. There's all kinds. This is not an exhaustive list here. Whatever it is, your favorite candy. They're all abstinence-based, which is hard to stop these kinds of things. They're all spiritual programs. They're not religious. No one is going to tell you to go to this church or temple or synagogue. But what is required is a belief in a higher power. And quickly in the steps, this higher power gets a name, God as we understood him. Step 11 is interesting. Sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood him. So the onus is to be intentional here if you want to get well. Now, this is an interesting thing for me because when I had my intervention with my fentanyl problem at work, and I was sent to a drug treatment center in the United States, which was one of the better ones around at that time, I walk through the door and I get registered, and the lady says to me, yes, you're here for drug addiction. Well, there's no cure for drug addiction, but God will help you with this. And I said, what? You know, I'm a scientist. Science has put men on the moon. Surely they have a cure for drug addiction. And she said, no, there is no cure. Only God will help you. This is a 12-step kind of treatment program. You don't like it, there's the door. So that was a shocking thing for me to see this kind of thing. And what I learned is that the 12-step programs are radical. Step 1 says you declare you are powerless over the addiction. Sounds humiliating when you first look at it, but it is really about humility, which is a good thing. And then it talks about admitting that personal agency has been completely lost. Life is unmanageable. Insanity has set in. Wow. This is reality orientation. That's why I was there. Now, it's hard to come to grips with this. And I've seen it over and over again with guys coming to AA or NA. They get there. They get there, but they have no idea where they are. A few weeks later, they sort of come to and realize, oh my goodness, all these people are drug addicts and alcoholics. I'm not one of those people. And then finally, weeks later, they come to believe, yes, that's me. I'm in a good place. Wonderful. Step 2 brings hope. They are introduced to a higher power that can restore this sanity. They ask God to remove the defects of character. Step 7. Finally, there's help available. Step 11 is very interesting, or it was for me. Becoming intentional to grow spiritually, praying only for knowledge of his will and the power to carry that out. Here, it's all about agency, power. Finally, power for what? Power to do what is right. What I called earlier the human conundrum, that we have limited agency. Even though the toolbox is full, we don't often use these tools. We often do the things that we hate. So finally, there's power here. Now, I never really understood this until I came home from the drug treatment center. Now, I worked in an operating room as an anesthesiologist, and I had vials of fentanyl with me every day. I could not believe that I could go back to work and have these vials in my hands again, because I used to use them on myself. I stayed home, I think, for a number of months thinking I need to switch careers. And, some of my colleagues thought I should as well. But I had a sponsor, a mentor who had been there himself. He was a physician. And he said to me, Harvey, you need to go back to work. And people there want you to come back. There are people who want you to come back. And I said, well, what am I going to do with these fentanyl ampules? And he said to me, God will remind you that the hospital purchased these vials of fentanyl, not for you, but for the patients. It's the KISS principle, Harvey. It's as simple as that. I thought, what? It's as simple as that? And sure enough, it was. I couldn't believe it. I did go to work. And they say that addiction is a disease of feelings, that initially you suppress these feelings with drugs and alcohol, but it's really the feelings that will get you well. So I go there and I get these ampules of fentanyl, and all of a sudden my emotions come up and think, oh, this is dangerous. But this is for the patients. It's not dangerous, Harvey. It was meant for the patients. It was my emotions and better thinking that really helped me through this. So yes, this worked for me. Step 12 talks about a spiritual awakening. And this is incredible to see at 12-step programs. I mentioned Marsha Linehan earlier, and she had a spiritual experience where one day she came to the point where she realized that she needed to accept herself as she was, with all her warts and blemishes, that she needed to love herself despite all these things. And a marvelous thing happened to her. She had a spiritual awakening, and she learned for the first time to love herself. And then she realized that you can only love others if you first love yourself, to accept the things that are there, but to be open to changing some of these. Step 12 talks about serving others. And this is so wonderful to see people, they start getting well. They have this spiritual awakening where they want to help others. They're filled with this kind of joy to bring help to others. And of course, I see this in CCMF with the guys who come to these groups. Many of them come to help others, and that's wonderful. This spiritual awakening, some call it a conversion experience, has been studied in evidence-based studies. Here's one from the Cochrane Library, which does meta-analysis of combining many studies to show that this has been shown to be substantially effective. People who attend 12-step programs and have addictions do a lot better than those who don't. And here's another one from the International Society of Addiction Medicine, talking about the role of spirituality in addiction medicine. And likewise, they've looked at a number of studies, and here's one they quote, that abstinence after discharge from professional treatment was found in one study to be 3 times as likely among patients who reported having had a spiritual awakening. They were so moved by these studies that they actually published recommendations, which are very positive, to include spirituality in treatment plans. So if you send somebody to a treatment program, any of them that are worth their gold have 12-step programs where they send people to, or actually incorporate them into their treatment program themselves. Now, key takeaways here that I want to leave you with is the cause of addiction is still not completely worked out. There are many factors, genetics, psychological, as well as social factors that can cause someone to end up as an addict. Trauma and pain need resolution, of course. Some of you have heard of Gabor Mati, who is a Vancouver physician who spent years working in the downtown east side. And so when he sees an addict, he doesn't say, well, ask not why the addiction, but why the pain? It's so common. Addiction can be overcome. Connection is the antidote to addiction, and connection can be found in many places and must be found. But be careful with connection, yet be courageous. Find someone trustworthy. You can't just reveal your issues with just anybody. And then learn the secret of honesty. Fear is what prevents us from being radically honest with others, because we think that they'll run away or think poorly of us. But in fact, opposite happens. Radical honesty promotes intimacy, and intimacy is what we want. This is a quote from chapter 5 of the Alcoholics Anonymous Big Book that says, "Rarely have we seen a person fail who has thoroughly followed our path. Those who do not recover are people who cannot or will not completely give themselves to this simple program, usually men and women who are constitutionally incapable of being honest with themselves. There are such unfortunates." Radical honesty promotes intimacy. And I had an incredible example of that on Friday night in my support group that I want to share with you. There was an individual who came, and he became brutally honest with where he was in his life, amazingly so. As I watched people's faces, I saw the incredible respect these people had for this individual. And if you've been to support group meetings, you've seen this yourself, how the empathy starts to flow and people reach out and show huge respect for somebody who is honest enough in this kind of safe place where there's confidentiality and where there are brothers who share a lot of these things. And becoming honest is wonderful to deal with the pain instead of self-medicating. So that's all I have for you today. 12-step programs major on community and spirituality. 12-step programs provide community where it's a safe place to connect and to become brutally honest. And they present spirituality, a transcendent being or God as you understand him, who can help us deal with what I call the tyranny of self. And we all know what that is. It's 3 a.m, you've had a rough day, you can't sleep, and what do you do with yourself? Of course, there's this human conundrum that you often do what you end up hating. For me, this is where my spirituality, my personal relationship with God helps me by giving me agency to do what is right. And without that, I wouldn't be alive today. So thank you for this time. I am open to questions or comments.
First and foremost, I just want to say thank you very much, Harvey. I'm just going to stop sharing your screen. Thank you very much for that presentation. That was amazing. There are a couple of guys who had to leave early who posted questions in the chat. So I'm just going to ask those questions to you while we're still recording, so that they can review the replay and get the answers. For the guys who are still on the call who have posted questions in the chat, I'll let you answer or ask those questions verbally. So first question is, can you please give us some ideas on how, as a society, we can bring addiction down when we're all suffering from this, even if it's family, friends, or coworkers?
How can we do this as a society? Well, the way I do it is by volunteering in different places. I don't like times alone, as I have mentioned, the tyranny of self. So I'm involved in the local crime prevention committee of the city I live in, and so I bump into a lot of people, and I've been told that I have the gift of gab, and so I connect with people. I ask them how they're doing, and then invariably they spill their guts and tell me this or that, and so I tell them, you know, my story or some of it anyway, and they listen, and they realize maybe they do need help. Yeah, so I think if you have the time to do a lot of volunteer work, to connect with people, meet them where they're at, and share stories that you've heard, even my story of where help is available.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I think everyone else is still here, so I'm going to stop the recording now. Just want to again loop back and say thank you very much, Harvey, for that presentation. It was certainly very educational for me, and I think there are a number of questions that are in the chat, but I think we'll ask you to start raising your hands, and I'll come to you in order. But thank you very much, and we'll stop the recording now.